The shuttle descended through the thick green haze that covered the world of Virelia like a shroud. The cadets inside stared out the reinforced glass as the planet's surface came into view, a vast, glimmering forest where every leaf pulsed faintly with light, as if breathing. From orbit, the instructors had called it beautiful, a living ocean of green that seemed to sway even without wind. But as the ship broke through the upper atmosphere, the crew could already see the reason Virelia was feared. The air was not just humid, it was alive. Clouds of microscopic spores drifted upward in shimmering columns, glowing faintly with bioluminescent patterns that looked almost intelligent, forming spirals and waves across the canopy. It was said that the forest exhaled at night, filling the air with its toxic breath. Among the group of alien cadets sat a single human, Captain Elias Ward, tall, quiet, and always watching. His uniform bore the marks of previous trials, the fabric scuffed and weathered, his gloves patched from field repairs. The others, representing species from half a dozen worlds, regarded him with cautious curiosity. Humans were often unpredictable, known for endurance more than intellect, but something about this one made them uneasy. He said little, but when he looked out the window, his eyes didn't show fear, only calculation. The shuttle touched down in a small clearing surrounded by towering fungal trees whose trunks resembled columns of wet stone. The air shimmered as the hatch opened. The first breath of Virelia hit them like a wall, damp, heavy, and faintly sweet. The smell of decay and fruit mixed together, clinging to the skin and armor. Some cadets immediately activated their suit filters, their helmets locking into place with hisses of compressed air. Elias stepped out last, his boots sinking slightly into the moist ground. He crouched and scooped up a handful of soil, rubbing it between his fingers. It was dense with clay and minerals, heavier than the sand-like dusts of most worlds. Useful, he thought. Very useful. Their mission was simple on paper: survive 72 hours without external aid, in an environment that became lethal at night. Each species was expected to demonstrate adaptation and cooperation. But cooperation among alien cadets had always been fragile, especially when humans were involved. Within the first hour, the others split into clusters, erecting shimmering polymer domes, scanning the ground for energy sources, and deploying automated defense turrets to repel wildlife. By mid-afternoon, the cadets' shelters were complete, gleaming domes surrounded by energy fields that hummed softly. The alien commander, a tall insectoid named Kelrin, approached Elias, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the pale light. "Human," he said, his voice vibrating like the buzz of a hive. "You do not construct a shelter? The spore clouds will activate at sundown." Elias looked up from the patch of soil he had been examining. "Not yet," he replied calmly. "I want to see how the air behaves first. If we don't understand it, we can't fight it." Kelrin's antennae twitched in annoyance. "Understanding will not keep you alive. The spores will dissolve your lungs." Elias only smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe they can be stopped before they reach them." The forest grew darker faster than expected. A strange twilight settled over the trees, as if the light itself had thickened. Every breath of wind carried new patterns. It was beautiful, but Elias knew it was death to admire it unprotected. He retreated beneath a broad fungus cap, its underside alive with moving veins. As he waited, he watched the air shimmer and thicken. Small glowing strands began to creep along the ground toward the nearest shelters, drawn by warmth and sound. Within minutes, the first alarm rang from one of the domes. The spores were sticking to the surface of the energy barrier, clogging it like a living web. The hum of the barrier turned uneven, flickering as if suffocating. Inside, silhouettes moved frantically, trying to reinforce the system, but Elias knew it was too late. The barriers worked by circulating filtered air, and the spores were blocking that flow entirely. He could hear muffled shouts from within the shelters, alien voices rising in panic. One dome blinked out completely, its interior lights dying as the filtration system collapsed. The glow of the spores swallowed the structure, and when it reappeared, the surface had turned dull and lifeless, coated in a gray-green crust. Elias stepped back slowly, keeping to the shadows. He didn't rush to help. He observed. The forest wasn't random. It was feeding. Every spore cloud was drawn to carbon and heat, the same way insects were drawn to flame. The cadets' shelters had made them targets. He removed his respirator briefly to test the air. The spores stung instantly, burning the throat. But he noticed something curious. The sensation faded when he covered his mouth with his hand that still carried traces of soil. He rubbed a bit more clay across his face, forming a thin film. The irritation stopped almost entirely. If you understood them, you could turn them. By midnight, the air had grown so thick it seemed liquid. Every breath of wind glittered like fog through glass. Elias sat quietly beneath his shelter of clay and bark, listening to the forest breathe around him. Somewhere nearby, something large moved between the trunks, its footsteps muffled by the spore-laden soil. He didn't move. He understood now why the instructors had called this the breathing woods. Every life form on this planet seemed connected to the fungal network, inhaling and exhaling in one vast rhythm. The spores weren't an attack, they were communication, a cycle of release and rebirth. He closed his notebook and looked toward the glowing horizon. He knew that most of the cadets wouldn't make it through the night, not with their machines choking and their filters melting. But he also knew that when the sun rose, he would begin building something different, something born of fire and earth, not technology. Virelia had its rules, and he intended to learn every one of them. For now, he waited, the faint green glow painting his face as he whispered to himself, "The forest breathes. So will I." When dawn came to Virelia, the forest looked calm again, but it was the kind of calm that hid something alive beneath the surface. The spores had sunk back into the earth, retreating to the roots, and the glowing mist thinned to faint threads that drifted lazily in the humid air. Elias opened his eyes to a dull green light that filtered through the fungal canopy. The air was thick with moisture, but breathable now that the night storm had passed. Around he could see, he noted, "And we'll build something that can bake protection before sundown." He began collecting materials, dry roots, pieces of wrecked metal, and thick bark slabs. Kelrin watched, bewildered, but followed his instructions. The two worked in silence, dragging debris into the center of the clearing and forming a rough circle of stones and metal scraps. Elias dug shallow pits in the ground and lined them with the clay he'd gathered, pressing it into the shape of bowls and domes. His movements were methodical, almost mechanical, as if his hands remembered the steps from some primitive knowledge buried deep in humanity's past. By mid-morning, he had built a crude kiln, a hollow dome open on one side, with vents cut near the base. It wasn't much, but it would hold heat, and on this planet, heat meant life. When the sun rose higher, the forest changed again. The spores that had vanished at dawn began to shimmer faintly within the trees, preparing for another night's bloom. Elias could feel it in the air, a slow, rhythmic pulse like breathing beneath his feet. He wiped sweat from his brow and motioned for Kelrin to gather more clay. The insectoid hesitated, his voice shaking. "The others, they think this madness. They wait for rescue." Elias glanced up, his tone sharp. "Rescue won't come for 2 days. The spores will kill us all by tonight if we wait. Help me, or die with them." Something in his voice, quiet but steady, broke through the commander's fear. Kelrin bowed his head and obeyed. As the day stretched on, the clearing filled with smoke and the smell of burning resin. Elias had managed to ignite a steady fire using broken polymer frames and tree resin. The flame licked at the clay dome, turning it red-hot in the thick air. The heat shimmered, and the ground trembled faintly as if the forest itself felt the intrusion. He began to mold smaller objects from clay, flat discs, curved plates, and mask-like shapes with hollow centers. He baked them near the fire, letting the smoke coat them in soot. He tested one by holding it over his mouth and breathing through the clay. The air passed through slowly, but cleanly. He smiled faintly. It wasn't perfect, but it would work. By mid-afternoon, a few surviving cadets had gathered around him, drawn by the sight of the fire and the smell of heated earth. Their faces were pale and uncertain, their movements uncoordinated from exhaustion and fear. One of them, a crystalline being whose translucent skin refracted the light, spoke weakly. "Human, you build—" "What?" Elias replied without pausing his work. "Filters, masks, things that breathe clean." The alien tilted its head. Elias adjusted his own mask, its surface rough but warm against his skin. He crouched by the kiln and stoked the fire higher, feeding it resin-soaked branches until the flames roared. The ground vibrated softly. The first spores descended like snow again, luminous and silent. But this time, the humans and aliens stood ready. The fire burned fiercely, and the heat rippled outward, forming an invisible wall that slowed the spread of the glowing haze. Elias watched carefully as the spores drifted close, their glow dimming near the rising heat. They twisted and shrank, turning to ash before touching the clay structures. The other cadets gasped in disbelief. It worked. For the first time since landing, the forest had been stopped, even if only within a small radius. Elias remained silent, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the clearing. He could hear the forest stirring, restless and confused. It had expected weakness, not resistance. He knew the reprieve wouldn't last forever. The spores would adapt. They always did. But tonight, he had bought them time. He leaned back against the kiln, the glow of the fire reflecting in his eyes. "Now we know what it fears," he murmured. "Tomorrow, we'll make it retreat." The wind carried his words into the dark, and somewhere deep in the forest, something answered with a faint, rhythmic pulse. The night was coming alive again, and Elias was ready. By the time the second night began to fall, the forest was no longer silent. A low, almost musical hum drifted through the trees, like the vibration of air over a deep cavern. It pulsed in waves, rising and fading, and each pulse seemed to make the soil tremble faintly underfoot. Elias had not slept. He had spent the day collecting clay, ash, and fragments of metal, expanding the kilns into a rough perimeter around the clearing. Now, as the light dimmed again and the first spores began to shimmer in the air, the entire place glowed with the soft orange of fire. He moved methodically from kiln to kiln, checking the air vents, adjusting the flames, and reinforcing the clay domes that protected the cadets. The others watched him in silence, their fear held back by exhaustion and a growing belief that the human might truly understand this planet better than anyone else. The forest's glow returned like the slow unfurling of a wound. The trunks lit up, the leaves shimmered with pale green veins, and the first clouds of spores began to descend from above. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, wearing one of the baked clay masks that now covered most of his face. The air around him shimmered faintly from the heat radiating off the kilns. He watched the spores move, studying how they twisted in the air currents, how some seemed drawn toward cooler areas, while others gathered near the edges of the firelight. The movement was not random. He saw pattern, clusters that followed a rhythm, pulsing like blood through veins. The forest was alive in more than the biological sense. It was organized, deliberate. Kelrin approached cautiously, the light of the flames reflecting off his glassy eyes. "The spores are gathering faster tonight," he said. "The fire slows them, but not enough. They are learning." Elias nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Then we will learn faster." He lifted a metal fragment from the ground and showed Kelrin the dark stains across its surface. "See this? The spores corrode through synthetic material but retreat from soot. We'll coat everything in ash," Our masks, our shelters, our clothes. Kelrin hesitated, then began instructing the others, his voice echoing through the smoke. Soon the cadets smeared themselves in gray streaks, transforming their shining uniforms into something primitive, almost tribal. The air filled with the smell of smoke and damp earth. The forest answered with a sound unlike anything they had heard before, a deep inhalation, as if the entire canopy was drawing breath. The spores around them thickened instantly, and Elias saw shapes forming in the mist, faint silhouettes of tendrils reaching down from the branches. The forest was reacting to their defiance. He shouted for everyone to stay close to the fire and fed the flames with everything burnable: resin, broken instruments, scraps of fabric. The smoke rose in black pillars, curling through the glowing green mist. The contrast was startling, fire and fungal light battling for dominance in the same air. Elias crouched by one of the kilns, the largest of them, and pulled a metal plate free from its surface. The heat scorched his gloves, but he ignored the pain. Beneath the plate, the clay glowed red. He began shaping the softened material into curved slabs, pressing air holes through each one with a metal rod. His hands moved quickly, instinctively. Every motion was guided by a deep memory of old-world survival. Humans in deserts, jungles, and frozen wastelands, always adapting. He built a new structure around the central fire, stacking the curved slabs into a cone that funneled the heat upward. The air pressure shifted, forcing hot air through the vents, creating a strong upward draft. The rising current pulled the spores higher into the sky, away from the ground. The other cadets stared in disbelief as the glowing haze lifted. For the first time, they could see the night sky, black and distant, scattered with faint stars. Elias looked up through his mask and allowed himself a rare moment of relief. "Heat rises," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Let it carry death with it." Kelrin stepped beside him. "You make the air itself fight for you," the alien said softly. Elias turned his head slightly, eyes still on the drifting clouds. "No, I just reminded it what it can do." But the forest was not finished. From beyond the clearing, a low rumble spread, followed by a visible wave in the ground, like wind moving through soil. The glowing trees swayed though there was no wind, and the spores that had been drawn upward now began to condense into thicker threads, descending in slow spirals. The forest was changing tactics, concentrating its release instead of spreading it thin. Elias realized it was adapting faster than expected. He turned to the others. "Keep the fires strong. Don't let them go out. We'll need every bit of heat we can make." He grabbed a burning branch and ran to the perimeter, lighting smaller fires between the kilns to form a continuous wall of flame. The ground hissed as moisture boiled out of the soil. As he worked, he began to notice something new. The heat was affecting the clay structures themselves. The longer they burned, the stronger they became. The outer layers hardened into a deep red shell, while the inner layers trapped pockets of heat. Each kiln became not only a barrier, but a reservoir, radiating warmth long after the flames began to fade. He adjusted their shapes with a metal tool, opening vents where the heat was weakest. Slowly, the temperature around the camp climbed. The air shimmered with distortion, and the spores near the edges withered before touching the ground. By midnight, the forest had quieted again, though the hum beneath the soil never stopped completely. Elias stood by the largest kiln, its surface glowing faintly, and removed his mask for a moment. The air was thick and hot, but breathable. The acrid scent of smoke filled his lungs, cutting through the sweetness of decay. He felt a brief sting of triumph, but it was not pride. It was confirmation. Humans were not the strongest species, but they were the most stubborn. The forest had forced him to reach back into the old instincts that no technology could replace, the will to live by any means necessary. He walked toward the edge of the firelight, where the trees began again. The fungal filaments on their trunks glowed dimly, recoiling slightly as he approached. He reached out with a gloved hand and pressed his palm against the bark. The filaments retreated completely, curling away from the warmth of his skin. It was as if the forest itself recognized him now, no longer just prey but something dangerous, something new. He lowered his hand and whispered under his breath, "You breathe. So do I. Let's see which of us lasts longer." Behind him, Kelrin watched in silence. The alien commander had begun to understand that this human strength was not in brute force or superior weapons, but in his strange ability to see life as a system, not an enemy. The cadets, now masked and coated in ash, huddled around the fires, watching the shadows shift. Elias returned to the center and began instructing them on how to maintain the kilns. "Feed the flames every hour," he said. "If you hear the ground hum louder, add more resin. The heat must not drop. Tomorrow, we'll build more." The night passed slowly, marked by the steady rhythm of fire and the faint whisper of spores burning in the air. By the time the first light touched the treetops, the clearing was a scar of scorched earth surrounded by glowing clay towers. The forest no longer pressed inward. It had stopped at the edge of the blackened soil, as if respecting an invisible boundary. Elias watched the sun rise through the smoke, his eyes red from fatigue. The cadets around him were alive, shaken, but alive. For now, the forest had been pushed back. He turned toward Kelrin, who stood beside him. "The spores will come again," the commander said. Elias nodded. "Then we'll be ready again. Each night we learn, and each day we build." He looked down at his hands, still coated in soot and clay. The air shimmered with heat between his fingers. "This world is trying to teach us something. We just have to listen without dying first." As the fires began to die down, Elias sat beside the nearest kiln, his back against the warm clay, and closed his eyes for the first time in 2 days. The forest still breathed around him, but for now, he was the one controlling the rhythm. By the following day, the clearing had become a camp of smoke, ash, and glowing clay. The forest watched silently from its green perimeter, its luminous filaments dimmed, as though calculating its next move. The fires still burned, though weaker, their fuel nearly spent. Elias rose from his rest, the lines of fatigue carved deep into his face. His eyes were red but focused, scanning the horizon as he listened to the faint rhythm beneath the earth. The hum was still there, but slower now, almost like a heartbeat recovering from strain. He knew it was temporary. The spores would rise again, stronger, smarter. He had to think ahead of the forest before it adapted to his defenses. He walked past the kilns, testing their temperature with the back of his gloved hand. The clay held heat well. Each structure pulsed faintly like an ember, still warm from the night's struggle. The alien cadets, now silent gray-streaked figures, followed his movements, unsure whether to fear or admire him. Kelrin stood nearby, his tall frame outlined by smoke. "The fires will not last another night," he said. "The resin is almost gone, and the soil grows dry." Elias nodded. "Then we'll find something else to burn." He crouched near the base of one of the fungal trees, his hand tracing the rough bark. Beneath the surface, faint pulses of light flickered. "This forest breathes like an organism," he murmured. "If we feed it the wrong air, maybe it will choke." He took his knife and sliced a shallow groove into the bark. The sap that oozed out was thick and milky, glowing faintly. He caught some on his fingers, rubbing it between them. It was sticky, dense, almost resin-like. An idea began forming in his mind. "Kelrin," he said, "bring me the broken energy coils from the wreckage." The alien obeyed, puzzled, while Elias collected the sap in a metal cup. He moved quickly, mixing the viscous fluid with ash and a pinch of powdered clay. The result was a dark paste that hissed faintly when exposed to air. "If the spores live on decay," he explained, "then let's feed them poison." He smeared the mixture onto a metal shard and placed it into the fire. The sap ignited instantly, burning with a pale blue flame that crackled and emitted thick smoke. The smell was sharp and acrid. Elias covered his mouth with his mask, but he watched closely. The nearby spores, still faintly drifting near the edge of the clearing, recoiled violently. The mixture was working. The cadets gathered around as he prepared more. "Spread it along the perimeter," he ordered. "The smoke will repel the spores before they can gather. Keep your faces covered." The aliens hesitated, then moved to follow his instructions. Within minutes, blue flames circled the camp, their smoke rising in twisting streams that met the canopy and hung there like a barrier. The forest reacted almost immediately. The glow of the trees dimmed, and the hum beneath the ground shifted to a lower, angry vibration. The spores had sensed the intrusion and began forming clouds deeper in the woods, gathering strength. Elias could feel the pressure in the air building, as if the planet itself was inhaling again. He knew the night would be the worst yet. The forest was preparing for war. He spent the remaining daylight reinforcing the kilns, patching cracks in the clay, and adjusting the vents to channel the heat more efficiently. His hands were burned and blackened with soot, but he worked without rest. The others mirrored his pace now, driven by necessity rather than command. Even Kelrin, who once doubted him, moved with silent obedience. The camp had transformed from a cluster of frightened cadets into a coordinated effort of survival. Still, Elias could feel their fear. He felt it in himself, too, a constant weight pressing behind his ribs. As twilight fell, the first signs of movement appeared among the trees. The glow that had once been soft and distant now pulsed violently, lighting the forest in flickering green waves. The spores were rising in visible columns, climbing like smoke in reverse. Elias took his place at the center of the camp, near the largest kiln, and held a torch in his hand. "When it starts," he told Kelrin, "you keep the vents open. The heat must rise high enough to push the air upward. If the pressure drops, the spores will roll over us." Kelrin's mandibles clicked nervously. "And if the clay cracks?" Elias looked at him briefly. "Then we burn with it. Keep it steady." The hum grew into a roar. The forest's exhalation came all at once, a violent burst of light and sound. Thousands of glowing filaments erupted from the canopy, releasing a storm of spores that filled the air like glowing snow. The world turned green. Elias shouted over the wind, his voice rough. "Light the sap, all of it!" The cadets moved as one, igniting the remaining resin along the perimeter. The blue flames surged upward, meeting the incoming storm. The impact was immediate. Where the smoke touched the spores, explosions of faint light rippled outward, each one releasing a shock of heat. The ground shook, and the trees groaned as if in pain. Elias worked furiously, adjusting the vents, adding fuel, and pouring more sap into the fires. His hands blistered, but he did not stop. The camp was surrounded now by a wall of living fire and burning spores, the air thick with glowing ash. The alien cadets held their positions, their masks blackened with soot, their eyes reflecting the furious light. The heat was unbearable, but it was working. The spores could not cross the smoke barrier, and those that tried burned to nothing before reaching the ground. Still, the forest pressed harder. The spores condensed into heavy threads, thicker than before, twisting together like living ropes that reached toward the camp. One of them landed near a kiln, hissing as it touched the clay. The heat charred it instantly, but Elias saw the danger. "They're adapting!" he shouted. "Increase the heat!" Kelrin rushed to open the kiln vents wider. The sudden burst of oxygen made the flames roar, sending a wave of heat so strong that the air itself shimmered. The trees nearest the clearing began to blacken, their glowing veins bursting under the pressure. The forest screamed, not in sound, but in vibration. The ground shook violently, sending showers of glowing dust through the air. The spores began to retreat, but not in defeat. Elias could sense it. The forest was pulling back, reforming deeper within itself, waiting for the fire to fade. Hours passed in a haze of light and smoke. When at last the fires began to calm and the air cooled, the forest was quiet again. The green glow had receded far beyond the clearing, leaving behind a landscape of ash and steaming soil. Elias stood at the center, his mask cracked, his face streaked with soot and sweat. The others were silent, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and heat. Kelrin approached, his armor blackened but intact. "The spores are gone," he said softly. Elias shook his head. "No, just waiting. The forest doesn't die. It sleeps." He looked at the kilns, their surfaces glowing faintly red under the night sky. The fires within still breathed like living hearts. "But now we know how to make it fear us." He knelt and pressed his hand to the warm clay. The pulse beneath it was faint, but steady, a rhythm of survival. For the first time since landing, he allowed himself to exhale fully, his breath fogging in the cooling air. The stars above were faint behind the drifting smoke, but he could see them clearly now, small, cold lights in the endless dark. The cadets watched him in silence, and without a word, they began rebuilding the fires that had gone out, feeding them with the remaining resin and debris. No one spoke of victory. There was none to claim yet. But for the first time, the forest had been pushed back not by chance, but by will. As dawn approached, Elias sat alone beside the largest kiln, staring into its heart where the flames danced quietly. He thought of the forest beyond, of the intelligence hidden in its breath, and of the delicate balance between life and death that now bound them together. He had come to survive, but something deeper had awakened, a strange understanding that this world was not just an enemy, but a mirror. The forest adapted, learned, and evolved. So did he. And in that reflection, he saw both danger and kinship. He whispered to the glowing clay before closing his eyes, "You breathe through spores. I breathe through fire. Let's see who learns faster." The kiln's light flickered, and somewhere in the distance, the forest answered with a faint rhythmic tremor, neither a threat nor surrender, but acknowledgement. When the fifth morning came, the world of Virelia was no longer green. The forest that had once glowed with its eerie luminescence now stood dim and silent, wrapped in a veil of gray smoke that curled lazily into the still air. The soil was scorched in rings around the camp, and the air carried the smell of burnt resin and earth. Elias woke to the faint crackle of cooling embers and the rustle of movement beyond the perimeter. The cadets, weak but alive, were emerging from the shadows, their gray-streaked faces barely recognizable under the soot. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. He could feel its consciousness still present but subdued, as if watching from a distance. The spores had not returned with the dawn. For the first time since the trial began, the air was clear. He rose from the ground slowly, his muscles aching from days of tension and sleeplessness. His clothes were stiff with dried clay and ash, and his hands were marked by burns that stung each time he moved. But none of that mattered. He knew the battle with the forest was not over until he understood it. Fire had pushed it back, but not defeated it. He needed to know whether it had simply retreated or evolved again. He looked around the camp. The kilns glowed faintly, their surfaces cracked but still warm. Kelrin stood beside one of them, his tall insectoid frame blackened but upright. The alien turned toward him, his voice low and hoarse. "It sleeps," he said. "The forest hides from your fire." Elias nodded, his eyes scanning the tree line. "It hides, yes, but it learns while it hides, just like we do." He stepped beyond the camp's perimeter, moving slowly toward the edge where the scorched soil met the untouched forest floor. The difference was stark. The blackened ring gave way to pale moss that pulsed faintly, as though breathing. The spores had retreated deep underground, but he could still feel them, alive beneath the surface, waiting. He crouched and pressed his palm against the soil. It was warm, not from fire but from something beneath. The hum that had once echoed through the ground was fainter now, but steady. The forest was rebuilding itself. "You're not done," he murmured. "You're changing." He stood and took a small glass vial from his belt, one of the few surviving containers from the supply kit. He scooped a bit of the pale moss and sealed it inside. The spores reacted immediately, glowing softly, swirling in the enclosed air. Even separated from their source, they moved as if aware. Elias studied them carefully. He understood now that the spores weren't just defense mechanisms, they were communication, the forest's way of sensing and responding to the world. That realization brought him a strange mix of awe and dread. "You're not just a danger," he whispered. "You're an intelligence." As the sun rose higher, shafts of light broke through the smoke, striking the clay kilns and setting them glowing gold. The surviving cadets gathered near the central fire pit, silent and unsure of what to do next. Elias returned to them, carrying the vial in his hand. "We're leaving," he said simply. Kelrin stepped forward. "The forest will follow?" Elias shook his head. "No, it won't need to. It's already inside the soil here. If we burn everything, it will just grow again somewhere else. But we can take what we've learned. That's how we win." He turned the vial in his fingers, the tiny glow within casting a faint green reflection across his face. "This is the forest's memory, and now it's ours too." He ordered the remaining fires to be put out carefully, leaving only the kilns smoldering at their cores. As the cadets dismantled the temporary shelters, Elias looked around one last time. The place that had been a death trap had become a monument to survival. Clay, ash, and smoke woven together like the bones of an ancient creature. He walked to the largest kiln, the first one he had built, and knelt beside it. Its surface was cracked, but inside, the embers still glowed faintly. He reached in with a stick and stirred the ashes until the last ember flared. "You taught me something," he said softly, "and I think I taught you too." Then he covered the opening with a slab of stone, sealing it completely. The sound of the closing echoed like a heartbeat fading into silence. By midday, the rescue craft descended through the haze. The hum of its engines scattered the last of the smoke, revealing the devastation below. From orbit, the camp must have looked like a circle of scars carved into the forest's skin. As the ship landed, the cadets shielded their eyes from the dust storm it created. A team of instructors stepped out, their faces tight with disbelief. One of them, a tall woman in a dark uniform, approached Elias. "You survived," she said, almost accusingly. Elias removed his cracked mask, his face smeared with soot but calm. "We adapted." Her eyes drifted over the blackened clearing. "What happened here?" He looked past her, toward the distant line of trees, and replied, "The planet fought us. We fought back. I think it learned what fire means." The instructors scanned the area, collecting samples and taking readings. The data confused them. The soil was hotter than expected, yet the spore concentration was nearly zero. The forest had receded for miles, leaving behind only silence. Elias boarded the craft last, glancing once more through the open hatch. The forest's edge flickered faintly with green light again, like distant stars. It was not dead. It was recovering. He watched it until the hatch closed. During the ascent, the cadets sat in silence. Kelrin was across from him, his eyes reflecting the faint blue glow of the cabin lights. "You did not destroy it," Kelrin said. "You changed it." Elias nodded. "Destruction is easy. Understanding takes work. Maybe now it knows that fire doesn't just burn. It also creates." He rested his burned hands on his knees, feeling the sting of blisters under the bandages. The instructor sitting near the front turned back toward him. "Your methods will be studied," she said. "You turned an entire survival trial into a planetary case study. Command will want a report." Elias gave a small nod. "Write this in your report, then," he said quietly. "The forest isn't the threat. Ignorance is." The ship broke through the upper atmosphere, and the green world of Virelia shrank beneath them, wrapped again in its mist. From above, the scars of fire looked like faint copper veins on a glowing emerald surface. Elias watched until it vanished completely from view. A deep fatigue settled over him, not just physical but emotional, the kind that came after understanding something vast and unspoken. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. In his mind, he could still hear the forest's breathing, faint but steady, echoing somewhere deep in memory. When the ship docked at the Academy station hours later, the cadets disembarked in silence. The instructors moved quickly to quarantine the survivors for medical assessment. Elias stepped away from the group, still holding the small vial of spores. It pulsed softly in his palm, alive and calm. He knew he should hand it over for containment, but instead, he slipped it into his jacket pocket. Some part of him couldn't let it go, not as a trophy, but as proof that understanding had been born out of conflict. As night fell over the station, he stood by the observation window, staring at the stars beyond. His reflection in the glass looked older, harder, but there was something else there too, a quiet resolve. He had faced something alien, something that had no malice yet demanded his absolute will to survive, and in that struggle, he had found something deeply human. Fire had not only kept him alive, it had taught him humility, patience, and respect for the life that existed beyond comprehension. He reached into his pocket, feeling the faint warmth of the vial through the fabric. "You breathe through spores," he whispered, repeating the words he had spoken to the forest. "And I breathe through fire. But we both want the same thing, to live." The stars outside flickered against the blackness like embers, endless and alive. Elias watched them until the lights of the station dimmed, his reflection fading into the glass. The silence around him felt complete, but it was not empty. Somewhere out there, Virelia was still breathing, and so was he. The trial was over, but its lesson would never leave him.